Good afternoon, everybody. Why don't we go ahead and start getting settled in so that we can kick off our next 75 minutes. We have some amazing guests with us this afternoon from BDO. And the topic that they are going to be working with us on is rethinking global supply chain, understanding how global economic shifts impact the supply chain. I think it's pretty safe to say that the economy and the world disruptions that have happened, I'm going to say lately, but really over the last couple of decades, have had a significant impact to companies, policies, global supply chains. Questions abound for all of us in terms of what the trade and supply chain will look like by December of next year, maybe even in 5 years. So over the next 75 minutes, BDO is going to help break down the trade complexities, detail what that means for companies, and offer some strategies. I think I speak for BDO when I say this is definitely an interactive 75 minutes. So please feel free to ask your questions along the way. Don't feel obligated to wait to the very end. As we know, it makes it more enjoyable when what you're really interested in becomes the forefront of the conversation. So with that, let me introduce the first speaker. Damon Pike is a BDO principal who leads the Customs and International Trade Services Group within BDO's International Tax Services practice. He's got more than 32 years of experience helping multinational companies navigate the complex rules governing the cross-border movement of goods and services. In addition, Damon advises clients on export compliance and export controls, often in the context of government contracts under the trade agreement. Over his lengthy career, Damon has assisted clients with all aspects of customs and international trade issues. For more on Damon's prestigious background, as well as those of his colleagues that are here today, please take time to meet them during the reception that'll follow this PD event, or refer to the slides that are going to be posted on the website. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Damon.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Is it working? So first of all, I'm just going to tell you I'm a technological klutz, so if this thing doesn't work, I know the guys back there are ready to help me. And before I forget, I do want to just introduce my colleagues here. Chad Leager, he flew in from Pittsburgh. He's delighted to be in a little warmer weather, although I flew in from Jupiter, Florida, so for me this is a little chilly. And he's our supply chain guru. Then Peter Torelli is local. He's here in Dallas, and he's my international tax colleague. So we're going to be sort of ping-ponging around today. But before we start, how many people here are actually from Dallas? Are you really from Dallas? Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you a story. I'm an Army brat. So my dad was a career U.S. Army officer. He spent 30 years in the U.S. Army, military police, and then he did J5, J6 stuff. But anyway, in November of 1963, there was an event here that I think everybody remembers, the assassination of President Kennedy. And at that time, my dad had been assigned to the Military District of Washington. And on that day, he got a call after the president had been killed, instructing him to report for duty because he was going to be in charge of the president's body. So and this is one of the reasons I want to tell this story, is because it's so nice that we're able to get out and be in person again. But when I was coming up here today on my Lyft car from my hotel, and as many times as I've been to Dallas, I've never been to Dealey Plaza. So I was literally sitting there on my iPhone doing my emails, and I looked up and I saw the Texas Book Depository, and I said, whoa, hang on, is this where, it happened? And we were right on that X, right on the street, going down, and the Lyft driver told me that he was a kid, he's almost exactly the same age as I am, and on that day, he was at school, but his father, who worked for the federal government, was on the overpass looking at the presidential motorcade, but his cousin had a Polaroid camera who was taking pictures of the side of the book plaza that faced the parking lot. And those Polaroid pictures had never been made public. And they showed 5 guys who sort of looked like Lee Harvey Oswald, but they all had shiny new shoes on. So think about that. But then he told me something that was even freakier. His mother was a candy striper who worked at Parkland Hospital, and she was there at the very moment that they brought President Kennedy's body to the hospital. And she said that, of course, there was a huge flurry of activity, but when the doctors went in to attend the president, she was not allowed in, nor was anybody else, because there were these guys that were in black suits that came out of nowhere who were not Secret Service. And that was, he said, my mother told me that story over and over, and I'll never forget that. And I said, well, you know what? My dad told me the same story because when he was at Bethesda Naval Hospital, he had orders to remain with President Kennedy's body, and he was not allowed in the autopsy room by those same guys in black. So, not to boost any further conspiracy theories, but I thought that was appropriate for today. And by the way, we did figure out the answer. There were multiple shooters, but anyway, we won't get into that. We are here today to talk about global trade and customs. And if I can figure out how to work this, I think I can advance the slides. We got the learning objectives. I've already introduced everybody. Here's our agenda, pretty simple. And we're going to dive into why customs and trade policy really matter. Does anybody here, by the way, have direct responsibility for the function of international trade compliance within your organization? Any black line responsibility? Any dotted line responsibility? Or do you just hear about it once in a while from people in your organization? The reason you probably just hear about it once in a while from people in your organization is because most companies use freight forwarders and customs brokers to do a lot of the, the shipment and the reporting side of customs. So it's generally thought of as an operational issue and a supply chain issue for that reason, which we're going to get into in more details. But there is a lot more to the field that we're going to talk about than just the physical movement of the goods. First of all, there's money, okay? At BDO, I sit with Peter in the International Tax Group, but actually, in the rest of the world, we have something called VAT, Value Added Services. We have customs duties, and we have excise taxes. Those are the big three, what we call indirect taxes. So this is a formal part of most corporate organizations outside the US because they have VAT. In the US, we don't have VAT. So here in the US, customs duties, like in any corporate organization, we're sort of the unwanted stepchild. Nobody knows what to do with us. We don't fit in anywhere, so that's why they stuck me with Peter in international tax. But we are really a lot more than international tax. First of all, they're above the line, right? Customs duties are cash. So anytime we're working on projects with our clients, our number one mission is to find the money. We want to find the money because once you find the money in the customs world, it's a permanent tax savings. So it's not just a one-time refund. If you secure a way to get a customs duty refund, it's only because you've identified a mechanism and a strategy that is going to save you permanent duties over time, typically as long as you continue importing the specific product that's attracting the duty refund, or as long as you remain in business for other issues, which we'll get into later. So that's a big deal. Cash is king, and everybody wants a piece of it. Secondly, what I found more than throughout my career, and I started, by the way, in 1989, so I've seen a lot in the past 33 years, but in this world of customs and trade, which used to be kind of the backwater, operational transportation issue, customs and trade has really risen in the C-suite for lots of different reasons. But really because of, number one, the financial exposure with all the cash, the 25% China tariffs that we'll talk about that came into place in 2018, and now with the US-Russia sanctions, which I'm going to talk on briefly, with the environmental and social governance initiatives that most companies are heavily involved with now, with the Forced Labor Act. All these things have really positioned this area as one that you just can't ignore anymore. You can't just leave it to your warehouse clerks. You really have to get some level of understanding of the sophistication and the complexity of some of these issues and how they touch the global supply chain, how they're part of total tax liability. None of this can be looked at in a vacuum anymore. And lastly, really more than ever, the trade policy that I grew up with through my career has now sort of become the foreign policy of the United States. So it's more than just duties, it's national security, it's defense, and so it's really become much more of an issue that is going to have an impact on what happens with our foreign relations, for instance. And that might be a good place to start, if I can, again, get the right clicker here. Before we dive into the US-China relationship, I was just going to say a few words about the US-Russia sanctions. That has percolated over the last 2 weeks, as you know, because of the events in Ukraine. And although we deal a lot with imports and duties and tariff issues, we also deal with something called export controls. For anybody who's exporting, you have any idea what that means in general? Export controls? You're not paying, when you export merchandise from the United States, first of all, it's unconstitutional to collect duties on exports. A lot of other countries in the world, especially Russia, collect more export duties than they do on import duties. But in the United States, it's unconstitutional. We have a prohibition in the US Constitution called the Export Clause that says no state shall levy taxes on exports from any state. So when you're talking about exports as a pure export issue and not on the receiving end, because when goods are exported, then they're imported somewhere else, I'm not talking about the receiving end, I'm talking about the sending end. So if you're a US company, it's not about money, it's about compliance. Export controls generally refer to dual-use technology that has commercial and possibly also military applications, and what kind of controls the US government places on exports of that, not only merchandise, but technology, software, services, all that stuff can be controlled for US government purposes for national security and so on. And so recently what happened with Russia is that the United States imposed new controls, the most sweeping and comprehensive export controls we've ever had on exports of 6 categories under what's called the Commerce Control List. I won't bore you with all the details, but basically, if you're exporting any of those technology products, software, again, software, hardware, information, services to Russia, you're gonna, number one, have to apply for an export license. And if you don't get a license anyway, not even for exports to Russia, but any other countries, depending on the end user, the end use, and the whole list of reasons goes on and on. But if you apply for an export license, there's going to be a policy of denial. That's important because I was at a conference last week in San Diego, and I was sitting at breakfast one morning with one of the presenters who was the Western Region Director for the Bureau of Industry and Security, and it just so, and that's part of the Commerce Department, by the way, and it just so happened that as we were at the conference, I was writing up our latest BDO trade alert on the new US-Russia sanctions, and I said, sir, would you mind taking a look at this after breakfast? I'll send you the email, and he did. And what he came back to me with on his comments was, yes, you're correct. Everything that you wrote in your trade alert, which, by the way, you can go to BDO.com, type in trade alert, or just go to Google, type in trade alert, Russia sanctions. But he said, what's really important that you didn't mention is that this is going to be a policy of denial for any export licenses to any of these places in Russia. And it's not just Russia, and I'll explain that in a minute. It's a policy of denial, not a presumption of denial. For every other export control issue like this, it's always been a presumption of denial. If you're an applicant, the government will have a presumption of denial, and you'll have to overcome the burden to show why you should be granted the export license. With these new sanctions, it's a policy of denial. So you can actually submit it, and there will be a denial. And that's basically what he said. It's not, you don't have anything else to show. We're not going to grant the license. But what's really more invasive about the new export controls on Russia is something called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. Has anyone heard of that? Has anyone heard of Huawei, the Chinese company that was, so a couple of years ago, you know, Huawei got dinged with all the counter cyber intelligence on the US and trying to steal our military secrets and all that. So in retaliation, for the first time, we applied the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which means that anything that's made anywhere in the world that's made with, directly or indirectly, with US services, technology, anything, is going to be covered by the new sanctions. Meaning, in Huawei's case, what happened was all the semiconductor factories in Taiwan were making semiconductor chips using their own machinery that was made in Taiwan, using raw materials that were sourced a lot probably from Xinjiang, China, which we're going to talk about on the forced labor slide. But the technology that was used to run the machines that made the semiconductors was United States origin. And so for that reason, the US government essentially shut down Huawei, and their sales dropped 60% in the past year and a half. So that's how effective these sanctions can be. And as you've seen around the world, it's not just the United States, it's the European Union, Canada, Australia. Everybody is singing from the same hymn book in these new sanctions. So Before I turn to China, are there any questions on the sanctions? Does anybody have any examples they want to talk about yet? Okay, so now we'll move on, because I know we have a lot to cover. I'm going to put on my other hat now. I'm not only a principal at BDO, but I'm also an adjunct professor of law at Emory University in Atlanta. I teach customs law, and I wrote the book, shameless plug, if anybody wants to go on Amazon, you can get Customs Law by Damon Pike and Larry Friedman. A little early for Christmas, but you can always stock up. So anyway, with China, well, first of all, I tell my students, and I'll tell you guys the same thing, you probably know this, but unless you're working in the government or in academia, if you're in the private sector, there's only two ways that you can make money. You can sell goods or you can sell services. That's it. So I'm with BDO, I sell services, but if you're anywhere else in the world and you're not a service provider, then you need to think about tariffs and trade. Because I don't know about you, but the last time I checked, every company I know of is trying to go global. And China is out there somewhere in the mix, no matter, even if you're not directly involved with China, you're doing business with somebody who's doing business with China. So you can't get away from it, which is really interesting because if you look at how we got here, I mean, China was the country that really invented the rules of international trade, with the Silk Road and the Han Dynasty and all that. And they really were the ones who used their military to kind of back up the peaceful evolution of international trade, because that's essentially my definition of international trade. It's making money globally without going to war. And the Chinese perfected that. And they did it centuries ago. We had Rome in there somewhere. But it went along great for a while. But then, we sort of got into this, industrial revolution. And then we had all these companies making all kinds of new products. And it really didn't become a problem until, what was it, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. I don't know if nobody here is old enough to remember the Great Depression, of course, but that was the Tariff Act of 1930, which was enacted in response to the Great Depression. And the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act is actually still today the main piece of legislation that we have that governs all US customs rules, all international trade agreements today. The only thing that's been repealed from Smoot-Hawley were the devastatingly high tariffs that basically shut down international trade because nobody could afford to bring anything into the United States when they had to pay 100% tariff. So that, of course, some people say led to World War II because that furthered the Great Depression, which had the spillover effect in Europe. Hitler came to power, we got the World War II, and from the ashes of World War II, what happened? First of all, China was nowhere to be found because they were fighting their own revolution for control between the communists and the nationalists and all that. So at the end of World War II, China had nothing to do with building the new rules of international trade. It was done entirely, mainly by the United States and Great Britain, a little bit of France, but we created the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. That was 1947. And that was kind of designed as a temporary measure to get everybody in the Western world playing by the same set of rules. It was mainly focused on lowering duties because that's what caused, the Great Depression. That was viewed as causing World War II. And so everybody said, let's level set, let's get rid of these tariffs, let's have free trade, yay, everything will be great, we can trade across borders, no more wars. So that went along until 1995, and then we had an event in 1995. The World Trade Organization was born. That was the successor organization to the GATT, and that, for the first time, morphed into more of a rules-based system for everything, not just trade and merchandise, but trade and services, government procurement, we had dispute resolution. All these things that we'd never had before in a global trade agreement were part of the WTO. That was 1995, and then, of course, that time period coincided with China's rise, and all the while, throughout the late 90s into the early 2000s, China was lobbying for admission to the World Trade Organization, saying we're a major industrial power and we should belong to the club. And so they were successful. They got into the club in 2001, despite all the currency manipulation that went on. And everybody knew this, but we assumed, and I wasn't involved in any policy-making role, but I have a lot of friends in Washington on the Hill, and we still keep in touch. But, there was the idea that getting China into the club, into the World Trade Organization, would somehow persuade them to change their behavior and really play by the rules. and corporate America was making lots of money in the early 2000s and 10s, and so everything went along hunky-dory. And then we had a change in administration in 2016, 17, whatever. It's hard to remember now, isn't it? Yeah, back then. The Trump administration came to power and decided to impose, in, let's say, retaliation, maybe that's too strong a word, but as a way of getting China's attention, these new tariffs were introduced, and they were designed to counteract those practices that are listed on the slide. I'm not going to read them. So that was 2018, and I'm going to have to get a little technical here. When these tariffs came about, they were published in a notice in the Federal Register. I'm sure everybody knows what the Federal Register is. But they were published in lists, and each one of these lists, I don't know if anybody ever looked through those Federal Register notices, but those lists have hundreds of individual tariff codes under the harmonized system. Has anyone heard of the harmonized system? Okay, well, we're going to talk about that too. But anyway, those tariff codes are very, very specific. Each single item that you're bringing in, whether it's a 10-cent widget or a $1 million machine, has to have a tariff code. And those tariff codes all have their own specific duty rate. And by the way, there's 5,000 different descriptions in the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States, which is a statute. So it is a statutory provision imposing the duty or the indirect tax based on individual nomenclatures. So these lists, when we were involved in this, we of course had to work with all of our clients and work through these lists, because if you were on the list and your product was actually properly classified, then you got hit with a 25% tariff, depending on whether it was list 1 or 2, and then list 3 went up to 25% from its original 10%, and then list 4A was 7.5%, one was suspended. Anyway, this was a nightmare trying to get through this with everybody, but it had real financial consequences, because if you suddenly went from paying 0 duty to 25%, guess what happened to your profit? It disappeared, and in fact left you in the red. So we spent a lot of time doing work with clients over the past couple of years to figure out ways to get out of these tariffs. There was also a process that was introduced in 2019 by the US Trade Representative, which allowed US companies to petition for exclusion from having to pay these tariffs. And the basic criteria were, number one, the tariffs are causing substantial economic harm to our company, but mainly, number two, we can't find this product anywhere but China. We can't even find it in another country. We certainly can't buy it domestically, but we have to buy this product from China. And unfortunately, the process that was put in place at the time was fairly arbitrary, and that's putting it nicely, according to some people. Basically, the administration outsourced the entire decision-making process to 3 consulting firms. One was connected to Marco Rubio in my home state of Florida. Somebody else was another political connection, and it was really not a very well-run process. That thing expired. All the exclusions that were granted expired as of last year, and so there was a, I'm sorry, we're into 2022, the end of 2020, time flies. So then there was a new process that was put in October of 2021, which allowed some companies to petition for another exclusion, but only if they had met certain criteria, like their previous exclusion was granted, and then it was extended, and then it expired, so it only covered like 500 products. So that didn't go over too well with people, because again, we're talking about a very narrow group of products that were covered. And so what's happening now, just to give you the latest, is there's a bill pending in Congress to force the US Trade Representative, not force them, but to put in place a process that's more transparent and which is will be more favorably applied to US importers and domestic parties who are being really hurt by these tariffs. If that passes, which there is some talk that it actually has a good chance of passing, the exclusions will be made retroactive. So in other words, for companies who apply under this new process, if and when it passes, there will be exclusions granted all the way back to January 21st of 2021. So that is a big opportunity if you're talking about paying 25% tariffs to get some of that back in refunds since the beginning of 2018. So that's a lot of money. There's also a lawsuit pending at the US Court of International Trade challenging the legality of those tariffs, and that the administration didn't follow the proper procedures under the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. Whenever you have rules that are put in place, you have to have a rulemaking process and so on. And that's currently being decided. And that whatever the decision, because this case involves, I can't remember how many hundreds of billions of dollars, it's certainly going to be appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. So we're following that too. But just on that point, does anybody have any exclusions you've applied for that were denied? Anything you want to share on your experience? Because it really was quite a nightmare for a lot of companies. We had a few that were granted for our clients, but the vast majority of them were denied, and as far as we could tell, they were denied for no good reason. So, but China has come back, another issue, which has really become a huge issue that companies need to pay attention to, and that is the forced labor in the Xinjiang region of China. Actually, it's pronounced, if you say it the Chinese way, I think it's Xinjiang, but I'm not Chinese, but that's the right way to say it, Xinjiang. And that area of China, in case you have looked at a map, is like as big as California, and it's huge, and it covers, that's the part of China that has all the minerals, all of the polysilicon that's needed to make semiconductor chips and electric batteries, tomatoes, cotton, agricultural products. It's a huge, rich region of China in terms of resources. So a couple of years ago, the United States took action on what I just referred to before, the Tariff Act of 1930. One aspect of the Smoot-Hawley tariff bill that still is in place today is a prohibition against the importation of any merchandise from any country in the world that's made with forced labor, so prison laborers, child laborers. But there was always an exception in the law since 1930 until 2015, and that law allowed U.S. importers to bring in merchandise made with forced labor if the importer was unable to source it domestically. That was called the consumptive demand exception. That was repealed under the Obama administration, and since 2015, the enforcement of that law under the Tariff Act of 1930 has just gone through the roof. And the first manifestation of this was the what are called withhold release orders that U.S. Customs began to issue in late 2019, but they really went into overdrive in late 2020 and early 2021. We got this withhold release order on cotton and tomato products, which I'm going to talk about. And then there's also one on the polysilicon from China that from Xinjiang that I mentioned. So, has anyone, okay, there's a question, good.
I do have a question.
Where's our mic? Wait a minute, we got to get the mic over here. Kelly, come here, Vanna, or Oprah, whatever, right here. Because we got people here who can't hear you unless we have the mic. Thank you.
This may seem obvious, but I mean, this whole exclusion process, most of the reason why companies import from China is because they can't make it at
Price.
here for a comparable price or anywhere near it.
Right.
So it sort of defeats the purpose if that was, I mean, maybe it's an unspoken goal of this is to encourage bringing some of that production back to, or at least nearshoring it maybe perhaps to countries that are a little more closer and favorable. So maybe that's just a comment and not a question, but what's your take on that?
Well, I think that's right, because that's very perceptive, because that was part of the criteria is that, number one, you couldn't source from anywhere but China. The reason being because we couldn't afford to buy it anywhere else from China, and that was one of the other criteria that was supposed to be considered, the severe economic impact of having to pay the tariffs because you couldn't find it anywhere else but China at that price. And so that's why it was very surprising when we went through this process with all the petitions, and those things are not easy to put together. You had to put in a lot of statistical data about sales trends and contracts and how long you've been working with these vendors. And it seems like nobody at these, well, it was really the US Trade Representative, but their decisions were made by these outsourced consulting firms. It was really surprising because none of the denials gave any reason. They just said, no, your petition is denied. And this is one of the bases for the lawsuit that's now pending, there was no remedy for judicial appeal. I mean, in every other area of administrative law, if you lose at the agency level, you have a right to have your case heard in a federal court. And in this case, it would be the U.S. Court of International Trade, because they have exclusive jurisdiction over all matters involving tariffs. And it's in New York City, by the way. I clerked there for one of the judges. It was a great place to work. But thanks, that's a great comment. And like I say, I hope the legislation that's pending will pass, because it really has a lot of bipartisan support in Congress. There's some other parts of that bill that are weighing it down, but that's one thing I think everybody can agree on. We need a better process, and we need it now.
But to your point, the intent is to create the urge to nearshore, onshore. Great, but there's a big disconnect between that and actually doing that, right? So that's the connection point is unachievable, right? If that's the message of it. So it's got to be thought about, differently when you think about that.
Yeah, and I can see a temporary relief process, right, because you can't just change overnight.
Right.
It doesn't sound like that was the intent here, at least it was confused.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question is, setting aside maybe the last few weeks where a lot of countries seem to be uniform or in solidarity with respect to Russia, looking back over these past, 5, 10 years, how is our country stacked up relative towards aggressiveness towards people that aren't playing with a level playing field relative to other countries? Do we tend to hit harder? Do we tend to look the other way a little bit more? I was just curious, and was there a lot of coordination with other countries with our methods and approaches?
Well, recently, during the Trump administration, we did hit back harder, but it wasn't done in coordination with the other countries. But a lot of people, you can say what you want about the politics of the previous administration, but I think everyone can agree it got China's attention. And it wasn't just China. Remember, we have the steel and aluminum tariffs as well that still apply to this day. We reached out, those were the tariffs that were 25% on steel, 10% on aluminum, and those were done not in conjunction with the European Union. We basically imposed those tariffs on the EU, and we only had specific exceptions for Australia, South Korea, and I think Argentina. But all other countries were subject to those tariffs, and in part, I think it was done because of the perception that other countries were using their trade remedies in a way that was targeted at the US, because when you're the big fish in the pond, everybody's going to be shooting at you. So that was, I think, done somewhat in reaction to that. But with the new administration, as you've seen, there has been more of a conscious effort to coordinate, especially with the EU. So we've signed an agreement to do away with the steel and aluminum tariffs when certain measures are met with the EU by the end of this year, I think. But all of that is to say that we have this overall body called the World Trade Organization that I mentioned earlier, which sits in Geneva. Angela Ellard is the current U.S. ambassador. She used to be on the House Ways and Means Trade Subcommittee for years. She's trying to, I think, reinvigorate it. But the problem with the WTO, again, is that when you look at all the member states, most of them are from developing countries. They're not from the Western countries. And when you have these cases that go to their the appellate body that's supposed to issue these, great opinions saying how world trade is supposed to work and how all rules are supposed to work together. The United States, sometimes we get on the short end of the stick. We had a long-running dispute with Airbus over the subsidies that took forever to get resolved. And I think we finally had the last case, and the World Trade Organization ruled in favor of the U.S. Surprise, surprise, we actually won one. But we've had other cases on cigarettes from Thailand, and the World Trade Organization definitely is part of the problem. It needs reforming. Okay, so back to our cotton and tomato goods. So what happens if you get a WRO issued? Okay, this is basically, you get a chance to prove a negative. Okay, I'm a lawyer. Does anybody know what prove a negative means? It is an impossible task. But you basically have to show, if Customs decides, based on their information, that they have a reasonable suspicion to believe that that container on that ship at that port of entry has goods made with forced labor, they say no entry. You, Mr. Importer, now have 90 days to prove to me, Customs, that these goods are not made with forced labor. And oftentimes, the importer they're buying from a third party. They don't have access to the records that would show that the stuff is not made with forced labor. So what does that mean? It means that you need to get busy now in trying to cleanse your supply chain, and Chad's going to talk a little bit more about this too. You really have to do a deep dive on all your vendors in the supply chain and figure out what the heck is going on. Where are these factories? Where is the merchandise coming from? It's a nightmare, and I'm going to share my story with you in a minute of how convoluted this thing is. I'm not going to go through all the items that Customs looks at. They're here on the slides. Please take a look at them when you get a chance. But really, it's based on two areas, okay? The International Labor Organization has 11 indicators of forced labor that are listed here. So part of the drill with U.S. Customs, and by the way, it's not just U.S. Customs. There's an interagency task force. This is how big a deal this has become. It's chaired by U.S. Customs, Department of Homeland Security. It involves the Justice Department, the Commerce Department, the Department of Labor, the International Trade Administration. All these, there's a coordinated federal effort at the highest levels to get companies to purge their system of forced labor. And this is the most visible manifestation of it right now with the withhold release orders. These are some of the considerations that you have to address, but one is on the blue on the right. I'm just going to highlight that, establish procedures to assess suppliers' labor practices. I mean, that's it. You know, you can no longer sit there with your head in the sand and say, oh, well, I'm just buying from an unrelated party and I don't know what they're doing, you know, I just pay them the money. And
that really becomes a supply chain function, right? That's a procurement function who owns the contracts, make sure you're having all the governance and things in the contracts, right? So again, it takes a regulatory aspect, but tying about the supply chain, it becomes much more in that supplier management bucket of an organization to manage.
Yep, that's where Chad comes in. Third-party risk assessment of current supply chain. That's the guy. But what really has got people's attention now is how this forced labor issue has morphed into law beyond the administrative procedures of U.S. Customs with the withhold release orders. Because this law that was signed on December 23rd goes into effect on June 21st. So right now, this law basically says that what I just talked about, if you're bringing anything in directly from Xinjiang as a finished good from that part of China, such that when you report it to customs, I don't know if you all know this, but on what's called the entry summary, which is like the transactional tax return for customs, there's a field for manufacturer ID code. And customs commercial targeting system now is so good, they can pick out the manufacturer ID code, even if people are trying to disguise it, because it's hard to explain. It's a combination of the country where the factory is located, the country's name, the street address, the state, the province, and the zip code. And that somehow it all gets combined into one manufacturer ID code. But customs can pick these things out like needles in a haystack now. So if you're bringing in anything directly from Xinjiang as of June 21st, guess what? It's not going to be allowed entry into the United States. And you're going to have to figure out a way to prove that it's not made with forced labor. But that's actually the easy part of this. The harder part is the law says that anything made wholly or in part in Xinjiang will be denied entry. So that means any raw materials that go into your finished good, no matter where in the world your finished good is made, and in this case it's probably going to be, you know, like Hubei and another province in China, maybe Taiwan, maybe Vietnam, I don't know. But all these things are going to come to a head on June 21st. Right now there's a process to write the rules, so I love it, don't you? The government expects you to comply with something, but there's no rules in place yet, but then on June 21st, you're going to have to comply with them, whatever they turn out to be. So I'm just telling people, based on my experience with the withhold release orders, that's what you should be preparing for. Even though we don't know if that's what the final rules are going to look like, that's what you need to be preparing for, and you need to get started now. This came up last year. I'm just going to share this quick horror story. So yes, the withhold release order on cotton products from Xinjiang affected one of our clients. They had gotten caught by this and asked if BDO could help. So I said, of course, we have a big office and we're the largest accounting firm in China. Well, guess what? When I called my colleagues in BDO China, they said, oh no, this is too politically sensitive. We are not going to help. So I was telling my client, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to go pair up with a law firm in China and we'll go find somebody. We'll get this done. So remember, again, this is a new development. You know, I've been in this field for decades, and I had never done this before because it was new. Nobody had ever done it before. So we had to sit there and establish a team. We had to design I'm not going to call it an audit program. We had to design the assessment program to address the 11 indicators of forced labor, which we got our law firm partner in China to execute on the ground at the factories. They had one factory in Xinjiang and one in Hubei. But the more, beyond tedious, the biggest part of this project that we had to struggle with was identifying the country of origin of the cotton that was used to make these finished goods that were coming actually from Hubei. So starting with the seed that was planted, where did the seed come from? Where was the seed planted? When the cotton grew, who harvested it? Who baled it? Who delivered it to the port of whatever the port of export was in the United States? Because we had been told that all of the cotton was sourced in the United States. So we at least had that trail to start with. And then we had to take the cotton from the port of export in the US all the way to China. And then we had to get the Chinese import records. We had to get the receiving records, the bills of lading, the manifest. Then we had to get the shipping records from the port in China to the factory in Xinjiang. And then we had to get the receiving records in Xinjiang. And then we had to get the trucking records when the intermediate finished goods were trucked all the way to Hubei. And then we get the, it just was endless. So it was a nightmare. But ultimately, we were successful in getting this withhold release order lifted. And we saved about $20 million in merchandise. But at the end of the day, just so you know, the fee was almost $250,000 with all the time we had to spend. So this is not an inexpensive undertaking, but it's something that you got to get started on. Just in taking it in steps, little steps. You can't, in this case we had to run because we were under the gun with customs. But everybody here should bring that message back home and start little steps, start doing stuff. So that's the big forced labor issue from China. Anything else you want to add from a tax standpoint? I haven't been.
No, keep on
Not
going.
yet. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Anything else you want to talk about?
Good.
Okay, because now we're going to talk about the customs triangle. This is the little bit of technical stuff, but it's fun because I've been doing it for a long time, and I think it's a great field. And I really mean that. I was lucky when I got out of law school. I somehow stumbled into this clerkship at the U.S. Court of International Trade in New York City. And I went to Wake Forest in North Carolina, by the way, and I just wanted to go to a big city again. I'd been stuck in Winston-Salem for 3 years, and I wanted to go to a big city, so I looked at this court and I said, I have no idea what this court does, but it sounds kind of cool. So I applied and I got a job, and the judge and I became good friends, and he's still alive, and I still am in this field, so sometimes things work out. But when you look at customs, there's really everything that we do as customs advisors, lawyers, consultants, it all revolves around these three topics: tariff classification, customs valuation, and country of origin. So I'm just going to briefly cover these. I had mentioned earlier about the harmonized commodity description and coding system. That's the global nomenclature that assigns all of these different descriptions. I'm going to have to move over here, Chad, excuse me, because I can't read. I'm too far away. Didn't bring my glasses. So as I said, it's 5,000 different tariff descriptions, and everything that you bring in has to be classified properly. So it's really like an engineering exercise. When I was at school, I went to Duke undergrad. I was a liberal arts major. I had no idea I'd ever be doing this stuff because it's like being an engineer. All the stuff you have to learn about the composition of an article, what it's made of, how it's used. And sometimes it gets down to like with textiles, you have to get down to the Desitex level of the fiber, which fiber predominates by weight. There's a lot of laboratory analyses involved. US Customs has a huge lab that they send everything to, and they try and figure out what something is really made of versus what the vendor puts on the label. Sometimes that happens. But anyway, I'm going to give you an example. Let me go back here. When I was in private practice, I had my own law firm for 12 years between my stint at Deloitte and now at BDO. I had my own law firm for 12 years, and I litigated, at the US Court of International Trade, I litigated this case on what is the proper tariff classification for a 3D printer. Everybody know what 3D printers are? They sort of like small batch manufacturing. So this guy up here is what we were arguing about. This was and this is a public court case, so I can talk about the name of the client. It was EOS of Munich, Germany. They're distributors in Michigan, but they were importing this guy here. This was a metal machine. You can also use plastics, but that was also part of our court case, but I'm going to highlight the one involving metals because these machines were about twice as expensive as the plastic machines. And then I included a picture here of what used to be what we'll call a machine tool for working metal, because what we were arguing about, it went to court about, was these competing tariff descriptions, okay? So I don't know if you can read this, but there's 4 digits that have to come first when you're assigning numbers in the tariff code. That's called a heading. So for legal purposes, the 4-digit heading determines everything. There's also 6 digits, 8 digits, and 10 digits, but you don't look at those until you decide which 4-digit code is the best one. So I said, when I looked at this merchandise, I said, well, this is obviously a laser welding machine, because when you look at the cross sections of the metal object, by the way, has anybody ever actually seen one of these things in operation? It's really cool. It's like an oven. It's like an oven. and you put there's an arm that sprays the powder on this metal. It's all metal powder, whether it's nickel, titanium, and it places it on a tray, and then there's a laser pass that comes over, and it melts the metal. And these are microscopic layers, layer by layer, according to the computer program that you've plugged into the machine, it will create a finished object. And that's how I came to the conclusion that it was a laser welding machine, because you could see the weld lines, at least at a microscopic level, and all these things were, in my view, supporting the classification under 8515 because it was duty-free. Let's see if I can get the light. See, free, woo! That's what we wanted. Well, unfortunately, the customs broker, and by the way, this is something to think about too. If you have customs brokers, most companies do work with them and they're very integral to the process of compliance, but they're not always paid to look into, like this level of detail. And they make mistakes. And so this broker had classified the machine as other machine tools for working metal or cermets without removing material, and got the importer EOS to pay 4.4%. And that's what we were fighting about. The other alternative was here, there was another possible third classification as a machine and mechanical appliance having an individual function not specified or elsewhere included in this chapter. That's what we call a basket provision. So it's not a very specific description. So if there's one that more specifically describes the article, that's the one that applies. So here, I lost, and so did customs, and we wound up with that 2.5%. Not as good as 0, but much better than 4.4%. And do you know why the government lost? Because they classified this, they wanted it classified as a machine tool for working metal without removing material. The judge found in that case that in order to work metal, there's an engineering term called plastically deform. You have to plastically deform an existing piece of metal and change the shape of that piece of metal. Well, this was not a piece of metal. It was a bunch of powder. So the judge told customs to go take a hike. And then he said, nice try, Mr. Pike, but I don't agree with you either because I can't see those weld lines with the naked eye. If I have to look at it under a microscope, I don't think it's a welding machine. So that's the end of the story. We lost, but we won because the client, like I said, from a savings standpoint, when you identify these tariff classification savings, they're permanent. They're still importing these metal machines and they're still paying 2.5% instead of 4.4, almost a 2% savings on a $800,000 machine. So that's tariff classification. I hope that gives you some idea of the wonderful complexities of this world. The next item is customs valuation. And this one is pretty simple. When goods are imported into the United States, almost all the time the duty rate is ad valorem as a percentage of the value. So the lower the value, the less you pay in duties. That can have income tax implications, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But in most cases, sometimes it's based on volume, sometimes it's based on weight, but in most cases it's based on value. So the value that we use most of the time in the customs world is called transaction value, and that's what basically the invoice price. So whatever is on the invoice price is what you pay in duties, times the duty rate. In our world, we live with our transfer pricing colleagues, and so we want to get as much input from them as possible. Customs and tax work in opposite directions. So the more you pay in customs duties, the less you pay in income taxes and vice versa. Because customs duties are recorded normally in cost of sales. So if you have lower cost of sales, you have more profit, and therefore you pay more in duties. So we do a lot of stuff with our transfer pricing colleagues, and anecdotally, I think about 80% of all world trade today takes place between related parties. So it's a big deal. Income tax, transfer pricing, customs value, tangible goods, even with intangibles, all that stuff has to be looked at. And then finally, we have country of origin and marking. So this is an area that has become a hot area of customs. For many years, it was not, because who wants to really spend time figuring out whether a substantial transformation has taken place in one country versus another? That's really the big issue here. Most production today doesn't always occur in the same, like in one country. Products are, processed in different countries. So the final country is where you have to apply the substantial transformation test that asks whether the finished good has resulted in a change in name, character, and use of the starting materials. There's been a lot of litigation on this. Of course, most companies have used this to try and get out of China. You know, they take a widget made in China, they take it apart, they move it to Vietnam, they snap it back together, and they say, oh, magically, now the country of origin is Vietnam, and I don't have to pay the China tariffs anymore. That's not how it works. But it's created quite a bit of unsettled law right now, and so we're having a lot of like ruling requests and disputes with US Customs about how to apply this test properly. And I'm not going to go into it any more than just to say, make sure you address all three legs of the customs triangle. So with that, I'm just going to finish up with ESG, and Chad and I can have a little discussion here about ESG, and then we can get some of your thoughts on what you're seeing. There's a question over there, too.
I was waiting to see if you were going to deal any with price dumping or any of those types of cases.
You mean anti-dumping?
Anti-dumping.
Sure, we could just briefly mention it. It's another trade remedy. The United States and all other countries, most other countries have anti-dumping and countervailing duty procedures to assess duties to offset price discrimination. That's anti-dumping, where you're selling in the United States at a price that's lower than your home market. And countervailing duties are used to offset government subsidies. The United States is an aggressive user of anti-dumping duties, especially on products from China, because China is considered a non-market economy. And so they have different accounting rules that have to apply, and they come up with dumping and countervailing duty margins all the time for products of China, because the way the rules are written. But Mexico uses anti-dumping duties a lot. The European Union does. India does. But they're basically additional duties that apply on top of whatever the regular duties are, plus the China tariffs, plus the steel and aluminum tariffs. So you can wind up, like there's a case now, mattresses from China, and you can wind up paying 180% ad valorem in duties on mattresses from China, because you've got the China tariffs, you've got the anti-dumping tariffs, and then you've got the regular tariffs.
The case that I've been following is the Quartz case. Turkey, China, Vietnam all being barred from import.
Well, that would be good for your business, I hope. I haven't been following that specific case, but it's a very complicated area. And the problem is that the importer is left stuck with paying the anti-dumping duties, which can only be determined in most cases in years after the date of import. Because when merchandise comes in, it comes in as a type 3 entry. The final assessment of duties is suspended until such time as all the administrative procedures are concluded, including litigation, up to and including the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. So an importer can literally get a duty bill 10 years after the date of import that says, you now owe me $2 million. And it's a nightmare. But back to, thank you for the question. Back to ESG. And you know, most companies, I think, is everyone familiar with that term by now? ESG, environmental, social governance. And that's, I think it really started in the financial services industry. You know, people who, my brother does that, you know, he's a wealth management guy. And so his clients were saying, I only want to invest in companies that have good social practices, they take care of their workers. And I think that's where it really started. And of course, manufacturing is not the same as financial services, but somehow it's bled over. And now it seems like all companies are involved in environmental and social governance.
Right, I mean, manufacturing really gets the finger pointed at it from a supply chain standpoint. When you really think about it in terms of the circle of influence of that, the distribution piece plays a lot more into the carbon emissions and the GHG versus manufacturing, right? So it gets, obviously, you know, I think it's a bit skewed in the way it gets viewed. And we think about ESG relative to what gets the highlights, it's the environmental piece, right, which is a huge part of it. But the social piece really is the area that's on the rise, right? And that's really where you have, I think, more risk as a company, because that's where you have the least visibility, right? Think about not only your own companies, where you're at with your own employees, the further you away are from major metros, from major geos, the more risk you have. But from a supplier standpoint, it's where you really have the exposure, because it's really a world we live in now. Let's call it cancel culture, whatever you want to call it. You're guilty by association, right? So whether you know about it or not, you're going to go, your name's going to be highlighted on the Wall Street Journal if your supplier has an issue. It's even gotten as bad as thinking about who your suppliers are and trying to get visibility upstream into that. So we talk a lot about it, supply chain hand in hand, because it is on the rise, and it's only going to become more important, I think, as we move forward.
Yep, and we're seeing it at BDO. We have a whole new service line dedicated to ESG.
Right, yeah, exactly. We're investing a lot of money in the firm, and it's a big area of focus, so we're out there. A lot of companies just ask us kind of, where do we start, right? So do we have a strategy? What does that really look like? And just having that broad conversation there, even relative to PE companies as well, right? Thinking about who you're buying, who you're selling, your level of accountability in that does not end at the time of transaction or sale, right? So we want to make sure we tighten that up as much as you can. Obviously, it's somewhat of a cost of doing business. It's hard to tie that to revenue and growth, unless you're with an industry where consumers want to buy from a company of your profile, right? A lot of times in CPG, consumer products, customers more and more want to buy from companies who represent their values, right? Where things are grown, the types of employees, things like that. So depending upon what sector you're in, it can tie to revenue and growth, but the value case of having a company invest the time and the money to build the infrastructure, to build the controls, sometimes it's a hard message as a C-suite to say, I need money for this, and here's the payoff, right? Because it's not really direct ROI, but your name on the Wall Street Journal, minimizing that is something that's got a very strong ROI if you think about it.
Yeah, reputational harm.
Yep. All right, so we'll cruise through these. So welcome to supply chain. So it's been an interesting 2 years for supply chain practitioners. Some of us say it's been a challenge, it's been a pain, it's been just constant stress, and where goods are, how much they cost, are all in everybody's mind, right? So the first thing everybody asks me is, when are things going to get better, right? And as much as my crystal ball is pretty decent sometimes, this has been a hard one to figure out. And even as, this slide's even a bit dated in my mind, right? Because we were saying probably Q4, we were going to get back to normalcy, and I say normalcy in quotes because what is normal anymore? But trying to alleviate some of the disruption, the congestion, the cost increases, what we were saying. Now, based on the last 2 weeks of activity with Ukraine and Russia, I feel confident in saying that we're going to see this play out into Q1 23, right? Seems like a long time, right? But especially with the oil, whether it's on the feedstock side in terms of access to oil and gas or transportation, I mean, you're just going to see cost increases going up and up and up, as well as shortages, right? So I just highlight real quick here around the different areas when we think about supply chain. Obviously, transportation is a big thing. The parcel market has gotten pretty intense in the last 6 months. Everybody here, I'm sure, has parcel activity. Not only have rates gone up exponentially, but they're also, increasing surcharges on all the extra stuff that they sometimes charge you for, and sometimes where applicable, they're really going after everything they can in terms of the accessorials, and they're making you pay within your payment terms as well, right? So it's usually you can pay it when you pay it. They're getting more aggressive going after their money as well. Relative to just port congestion and things like that, not much has changed. I think we hear less about it in the news than we used to, because there's obviously bigger things happening in the world, but we're still seeing West Coast port congestions. A lot of companies are checking out the alternatives to how we can go to the East Coast, because those ports are a little more fluid. And we're seeing some congestion build up in Savannah and some of the East Coast ports, but it's not nearly as bad. So if you can invest the time in terms of transit days, let's say you can kind of get it, to add 10 days in transit to go East Coast. It's better getting it off the ship there than waiting queued up in the port in the West Coast. So think about how you can do those analysis and work with your suppliers to understand what the reality is and the impact on rates as well. The bad news is, just because we get cargo to the ports and get it off the ships, you still have to have trucking to get it out of the ports, right? So just because there's one pinch point here we can benefit from, if we don't have the carriers to get it out of the port, it doesn't really matter, right? Which is what creates the backlog when we think about the queues in terms of the berth and where the ships are sitting. So no end of the tunnel there in terms of driver shortages in the U.S. It's been a problem ever since I've been in supply chain for 20 years, right? So I heard about it a long time ago. We hear about programs and incentives, things like that happening, but it's far off from relieving the stress of what that's going to be. Labor is a topic that I have a hard time even addressing, because it's, again, if I could solve the labor shortage, I wouldn't be working at BDO. As much as I like it. We do see some, obviously, challenges there. A lot of in the transportation market, too, it's like, if drivers have a choice of where to work, are they going to do last mile or are they going to do long haul? Last mile is technically easier, less stress, pay is the same or more, sleep in your bed every night. You're hauling boxes, you're not hauling chlorine or other cargo that's restricted and things, so you're seeing some challenges there between last mile and long haul. Plant warehouse labor, that's always been a challenge with high turnover. Obviously, the Amazon effect has a big impact in warehouses. So anywhere you see an Amazon warehouse, if you're within X mile radius from there, you're going to have a hard time retaining employees, unfortunately. People would change jobs for $1,000 signing bonus and $4 more an hour, right? So that's the reality of it there.
Chad, can I ask a question on the drivers? Because that's a really big point. All this merchandise gets to the Port of Long Beach and gets shipped inland to Ontario, California, and then it sits there because there's nobody to drive it from Ontario to Chicago. But what are you seeing with the driverless trucks? Is that really happening? Like, I can't imagine these 18-wheelers coming at me with nobody behind the wheel.
Yeah, so there's two angles there. One is the autonomous vehicles, right? Is that a thing? Yes, it is. Every time Tesla has an accident with one of theirs, right, it takes the trucking industry steps and steps backwards of getting there, right? Obviously, you can't ever have an autonomous vehicle, even with a driver in there sitting, hauling hazardous cargo, right? I have a lot of chemicals background. That can't ever happen, right? If we're being realistic, as much as we want to hear about it and get excited about it, there's certain things where it'll work and it won't work. I mean, my crystal ball says we're a long ways off on that one. Yeah, decade at least, if not more. Shortages are still going to be impacted. I mean, there's still problems from the last winter storm they had down here in Texas, right, with raw material shortages. So the Russia-Ukraine thing's only going to make that worse, especially on the feedstock side. So not going to get much better. This slide I'll skip. I mean, this really hopefully resonates with you. You have it in your package. But it's kind of what we're hearing from clients, right? I hit some of the points in the last slide around cost increasing. Damon did a great job teeing up geopolitical disruption, labor constraints. So supply chain is still a tough topic. I feel like Debbie Downer a lot of times.
Just going back to your previous.
Yep.
You talked about a lot of supply factors, but what about demand? Because it's been pretty clear there's been unusual demand.
Sure.
Where do you factor that into your view of when that supply and demand comes back into balance?
Yeah, I think demand's still holding strong in a lot of sectors, right? A lot of industries, demand's still pretty strong. It's so strong that, I think it's just creating more stressor in there. The one thing about demand we tell companies is if you model go through your S&OP process, right, and think about demand forecasts, a lot of companies just do history. And if you take the last 2 years of history and take that as what you're going to forecast against, you're going to have a heck of a hard time. You're going to find yourself we've got plenty of examples of way too much, right? Like you forecasted the wrong SKUs, especially like the biking, like outdoor industry, things like that, consumer products industries, where people had more time. They were at home in their house. They were buying a lot of the home fitness equipment. Peloton's a great example of that, right? So if you take history and just add 5% on that, you're going to find yourself really hurting. So I think that puts more focus on the need to really do an intelligent, forecasting S&OP process, and don't take that, because I think at least in the U.S., I mean, we buy stuff. I mean, consumer demand is just all-time high, right? So I really see that holding steady or continuing to grow, right? I think the gas prices make people nervous, right, wrong, and different. That impacts people's behaviors overall. So you might see maybe a little bit of dip, but I don't see anything. These are just some considerations we think about when we think about all that's happening in the world and the globe. And I spent 2 years in a prior life in a customs and trade practice. So I was a supply chain guy in that practice that could help kind of be the translator, so to speak, to help bring, think about the supply chain solutions differently. So, sorry. Yeah, please.
Well, you mentioned a lot about trucking, but what about rail? I mean,
No, definitely a mode. I had a conversation today around intermodal volumes, right? I mean, I think the intermodal volumes are actually down a little bit. And the question that I was asked was, when you come out of the ports and you think about intermodal, is why aren't intermodal routes full, right? Why aren't we having capacity issues there? And my answer is a lot of times I think trucking is seen as kind of the fastest way to get it there, right? And a lot of times the faster mode of transportation is a way to cover up for poor planning. So you don't have the luxury of adding 2 weeks to get across the U.S. with intermodal, right? So you're constantly going for that premium mode in terms of that. Or in the bulk business, you have rail to trucks transfer, right? So why aren't we using transloading more? Things like that. So the rail market in terms of rates, that one's a little harder to think about, like what drives the rate increases, because it's not just based on capacity, right? It's based on whether you're open or closed, whether you have competition at your origin point, whether you're interchanging, things like that. So rail pricing to me has never been anything that you could actually scientifically figure out, because they're monopolies at the end of the day, at least the big four are. So the rail pricing is, to me, an odd one. But
What about, did you all see those videos about all the theft on rails as they come in and out of Los Angeles? If you saw those, people are just jumping on the rail cars and stealing everything out of the inside of the
Wild West, literally, right?
It's
Who would've
really
thought
the
you'd see
Wild West.
people popping out of boxcars and stealing stuff? But yeah, I mean, so I think that, some rail perspective there. The truck, I talked about the air piece. Container ships are just, I mean, when we had our executive order, it came out, 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago, that tried to somehow influence the pricing of containers and not gouge, right? Not paying the $20,000, $30,000. As ambitious as that was and respectful as it was, to think that the U.S. government can influence the rate market when 99% of the carriers are foreign flag carriers was an absolute stretch, right? So that one continues to be a challenge. I also think in the transportation market, there's not always that much interest in putting capacity back in the market, right? Would you rather keep what you have full and utilized, maximizing rates, or would you rather increase capacity and have to deal with empty backhauls, things like that? So, I mean, container ships were leaving the ports of LA and Long Beach empty, right? They offload and they go run back to Asia to get the $30,000 containers because they don't want the weight for the cheap freight to go back east. So, other questions? Oh, shoot. Peter.
Well, we got 10, but
All right.
if there's other questions.
I'll hit this one real quick. These are things we really think companies should be focusing on more, right, around thinking about, we talked about supplier risk, supplier management, right? So a lot of things have changed in the last couple of years. So we got to spend more time really assessing, supplier risk and really saying, have the profiles changed and has our appetite for risk changed? I guarantee everybody here says our appetite for risk has changed because we got burnt really bad. So putting some more diligence on there, getting the procurement guys doing things more differently. We talk a lot about simulation and modeling, right? So there's a lot of technology out there that you can do to actually create digital twins in your supply chain. That's just a fancy word for saying it's just modeling, right? Doing scenarios. What if this happens? What if there's a war? What if there's a pandemic? Wait, those things just happen, right? So they're real things, right? What if borders close? And you can really model, it's very sophisticated, say what's the impact on inventory? What's the impact on cost, service levels, things like that. Get your teams thinking about that differently, being proactive. Having a plan A, B, C, and D is good. If B, C, and D aren't actionable, aren't cost effective, they don't matter, right? So get real about your backup plans. Hold your teams accountable for doing that, because the reality is the things that have happened in the last 2 years will happen again. We talked about ESG. This real quick is a slide we talk about. It's our global value chain slide. We can talk more about it at happy hour dinner. Ask Peter and I and Damon about it. We're real excited about it. It's how we all work together, supply chain, tax, and other functions, because a lot of times we don't play well together in the corporate America, so.
We do.
Peter.
Thanks. So obviously with everything that's been talked about previously, it all comes back to, well, what is international tax? There's always going to be issues that are going to hit you from a direct tax perspective, right? Damon talked about indirect pieces, and then as you're changing your supply chain, everything's going to continue to evolve, but it's going to impact you. And so, again, this is just, you can take a look at this, but this is things to be thinking about. How is your business going to be dealing with these issues? Are you thinking about the right things as your underlying business footprint is changing? And what we're seeing a lot in international tax, and we touched on this a little bit, but it is getting to companies that are truly nearshoring or looking to diversify, move out of China. And I'm working with a company right now who moved out of China to Vietnam. Now they're moving out of Vietnam, moving to Mexico, Colombia, things like that, because they want to be closer to their marketplace and also have multiple areas that they can warehouse and produce. other, rates, right? So that's the play here, and this just gives a little bit of flavor behind what the Biden administration was looking to do as part of that. Again, right now it's kind of off the table, but there's some stuff that's coming back online as maybe we can raise some revenue some ways before the midterms. Again, the high-level considerations around what are the main drivers, and then really this is the big piece right here. A lot of the drivers for the U.S. tax changes are being tied to the OECD BEPS, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So Pillar 1 is looking at, it's really targeting U.S. companies that have the most revenue, that have the biggest returns, and all the non-U.S. all the non-U.S. jurisdictions are saying, we want a piece of your tax revenue, and we're coming after it. So that's Pillar 1. Pillar 2 is saying, we're just gonna raise the minimum rate to 15%. So that's looking at Switzerland, Ireland, places like that where their rates are lower than 15%, and it's pushing them up to a minimum tax. And then this is just highlighting how some of the U.S. pieces that were being discussed are tied back into Pillar 1 and Pillar 2.
Peter, didn't they, I thought on the cobwebs of my mind somewhere I read that, hadn't they agreed to the 15%?
They have, so but that's the piece that I was just gonna touch on, because the 15%, right, we talk about Pillar 2, ours is 21, right, but how does guilty in the U.S. match up with the 15%? Because right now, nothing's changed there. So what's gonna happen? Our country's gonna come after us and say that minimum inclusion is not enough. And then the 15%, right, they've all in theory agreed to it, but you're hearing a lot of issues with actually implementing that. So in the past couple of weeks, a lot more governments are realizing that it's not just as easy as just changing their local rates. It's how is it actually gonna be pushed through every single parliament and Congress in each of the 140 countries that agreed on it. This is one of the items they were trying to get away from, right? So the idea here is to say, well, all these other countries were going to put digital service taxes on US companies that were selling into each of these countries. By having a minimum tax, they were gonna shelve this. Well, that's not gonna be the case if we can't pass it. So the US is not gonna pass it right now. But all of these other jurisdictions, are they gonna come back and then hit the US companies with their digital service taxes? And then finally, this just sums it all up, right? This is saying, look, there's so many different competing factors when it comes to direct and indirect taxes and the underlying push by all these other countries for revenue. So it's a balancing act of, okay, well, you're gonna have to have more tax audit, so how much do you have to do and actually put in place versus all these other outside pressures for the G20, G7, and all of these other 140 countries that say we're having a minimum tax. So at the end of the day, right, your business is gonna perform, the tax piece is not gonna drive the business, but you always have to think about it when you're thinking about how your business is going to adapt and change. There we go.
So we always say in that space, when you think about the tax piece, what's going to happen, right? Back to about modeling, where you have optionality of moving assets around suppliers, things like that. When you have optionality, or you need to have optionality because you're going to get painted into a corner on that stuff, that's where the modeling comes into play, right? Thinking about the near shore, onshore, different shore. It's important to do the diligence because what you're going to do is make decisions off the tax piece, but if you don't really look at the physical flow of goods, you might set yourself up long term to really make a bad decision. That's going to be hard to unwind if you don't put the time in up front.
But on this tax thing, I mean, so I just have to ask this, like realistically, if all these countries are gonna have to simultaneously agree, who's gonna be the first? I mean, how is this ever gonna move forward? Because we can't get anything done in the US Congress anyway. This is a global issue. So what are we supposed to wait for another country to go first? How is it actually gonna?
I mean, I think the EU is going to lead the way, okay. and it's usually the UK is usually the leader. I know they're not technically in the EU, but they're usually leading the way in that. But France and Germany are ones that are really driving this.
Do you have any like expected timetable for when?
I think it has to be done by 2023.
So, but not this year, because of course
no,
we
not
haven't.
This year, yeah.
Okay. Interesting. And what you didn't we didn't mention because we're out of time, but the digital services tax, the U.S. Trade Representative has ongoing investigations of some of these countries to impose trade remedies if they proceed with imposing digital service taxes on U.S. companies. So another interesting twist to the plot. The plot thickens.
That's right.
As always.
We are out of time, but all three gentlemen are going to be joining us for the reception as well as for dinner, and I do encourage you to continue talking with them because this is extremely, I find, interesting information, even if it doesn't have a direct impact on my particular business. Overall, as a consumer, it does have an impact. I am going to turn things over very quickly.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I just had one question. Sorry, Kelly. Being someone in the oil and gas business and, being kind of attacked by our president recently, this supply chain stress that you talk about that's keeping prices up, has anyone reported that to the administration? Because our president gets real upset over price gouging, and we need to dig into that.
Hey,
He'll talk to.
if you've seen the memes on the stickers on on the gas stations, on the, that tells you, I think, what we're.
Okay.
Yeah.
It upsets me. I'm going to call.
Hey, that's.
Tell him to get on it.
You call me, you hit transfer, then I'll answer the next one. All right?
Okay, thank you everyone for being here. Before we go out, round of applause. Before you go out there, just wanted to let you know that we have a new attraction out here in the lobby called the Let's Connect desk. And for all of you that have been members for a long time and you've always wanted to be movers and shakers and, power play people in the organization, this is an opportunity to learn more about FEI, learn more about the committees that are involved in making all this wonderful stuff happen. And we would love for you to come by and just pick up a little information. And if you're interested in contributing your time to the organization beyond the meetings and all the fun that we have, give it a look, respond, visit with one of the people that are out there. We'd love for you to find a way to participate more. Who knows, someday when you grow up, you'll be more like Chris or Lista or some of these people that have committed their life to FEI. Thank you. Go enjoy. Go enjoy.
Yeah.